All right. All right. Welcome, everyone, to the July IGRI Research Seminar. My name is Devor, and our presenter for this month, really, to this group, doesn't really need an introduction. It is, of course, the one and only Ute Brady. Yeah, and her presentation today, as you can see on the screen, or you will see, because I think right now it's just in the speaker view, is titled "Toward a Better Understanding of Data Provisioning in Open Access Biodiversity Portals." So, Ute, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Devor. And good morning, everybody, or hello if you're not on the West Coast. Thanks for showing up, and I appreciate you being here. And I wanted to, well, I guess I don't need to introduce myself because everybody pretty much knows me. But I did want to say that the research that I'm going to be presenting today was done in collaboration with Beckett Sterner at Arizona State University and Zoe Nyssa at Purdue. It was funded by the NSF as a Explaining Differential Success in Biodiversity Knowledge Commons Collaborative grant. So just to get that out of the way. And the goal of my presentation is, I guess full disclosure is this is a foundational research that is going to set the stage for future work that we've already started and are continuing to do on this project, but also on other projects. It's been a long time coming, much longer than I'm willing to admit. And with that said, I think we're really close to being able to push this to a journal, but there are still a little bit of bumps and some feedback that I'd like to get from the community, and I'll go over those as I go through the presentation. But please feel free to push hard and to give me any feedback that you think might be important. It's all important to me, and I think it's really valuable to hear from you on this. And now I'm trying to figure out how to move. Okay, so the outline in general for this presentation is to just introduce you to the research itself and some key concepts that I think are important to understanding what's going on. I'll introduce you to the case studies, which in this case are 4 online biodiversity portals, and our overarching research question. Of course, I'm going to be talking about the institutional grammar 2.0 and how I use that to explore data provisioning in these portals. And I wanted to talk to you and specifically get feedback on a deontic and modal table that I've developed, and also at looking at expanding Ostrom's rule typology to constitutive rules, which is in part an extension of the work that I did in my dissertation, but is also inspired by 2 people who are here, Adela and Tomas, who have been working on applying the rule typology, the regulative rule typology to constitutive rules. Then I'm going to talk about results and discussion and findings. Honestly, I don't care if I get through all my slides. I have many slides. This is supposed to be interactive, so if there's something that I say that doesn't make sense or you want to comment on, please feel free to jump in. There's no need to wait till the end. And I'm happy to not finish my presentation if we want to engage in a discussion on any of these elements. So, are there any questions so far? Shut up, Ute. Keep going. So let's start with the introduction and key concepts. And I'm assuming everybody can see my slides, right? Okay, cool. All right, so broadly speaking, as we all know, biodiversity loss is occurring. It's accelerating globally. Everybody knows this. And there's many reasons for biodiversity loss, mainly point our fingers at humans. But beside that, this research is kind of focused on this kind of scenario. So we have these primary biodiversity data sources, 4 of which I'm going to be talking about. Then there's modeling, predictive modeling knowledge, predictive modeling. All of this, I kind of feel like is one bubble where scientists are using the data and basically communicating with each other in various biodiversity related aspects. Then we have decision making that occurs internationally, regionally, nationally, and at the local level. But there's this persistent disconnect about what's happening here and what's happening here. And a lot of the literature has been focusing on contributing data to, so creating knowledge or sharing information, open access licensing, which is all important. But I think the main thing that's been missing is that we need to start more effectively looking at fixing this disconnect. And that involves looking at the data it's here and how it's useful. That's not what the paper that I'm doing today is going to be talking about, how useful this is to decision makers. This is the foundational paper that kind of tries to shift the emphasis from data provision to look at data provisioning as a whole, which means it's not just about contributing data, but it's also essentially about maintaining the data. Who's maintaining the data? How accurate, reliable is the data? And how up to date is it? And then this will be the foundation to look at it, how useful it might be, and who are the people that need to have this information. But that's further on down the line. So this is the big, broad, overarching social dilemma or institutional dilemma. Now, what is biodiversity data in the context of these portals? So does anybody here use iNaturalist or is familiar with iNaturalist? I see some nods. So cool. So you're out hiking in the desert, and you're Bernard Dupont. You see a javelina in the desert. You take a picture, make an observation on your iNaturalist, and then push it to the iNaturalist portal. It becomes part of this community database. And as soon as you take the picture and you add this information, an observation record is created in iNaturalist, which basically logs the location that the picture was taken, the date, and then any other information that you might have added. Maybe Bernard saw that it was a male, so he added that. He added that it looks healthy, whatever. That all becomes the observation record. And then if 2 or 3 iNaturalist community members agree with this identification, iNaturalist aggregates its data and regularly pushes it up to a global data aggregator called the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which then does some modifications and posts the data on its online database. And sorry, was somebody asking a question? Okay, so what are vouchers? This is another key concept in this research. So basically, a voucher is what it says it is, right? It vouches for study findings. It provides evidence that can be used to verify and replicate a phenomena. And both digital, like the javelina picture, and physical vouchers, like a skeleton or a frozen tissue from a javelina, provide a means to promote verifying and replicating a phenomenon. However, and vouchers can also be used to generate new data. So you can use Bernard's photograph along with other javelina photographs taken at the same time in the same vicinity and generate new information. You can also use physical vouchers. So the ability to create new generation exists both with digital and physical vouchers. However, we think that the new knowledge generation is higher when there are actual physical specimens. Like, for example, if you have a bee body, you can study the parasites and any trace elements, pollen that remain on the bee. You can also examine its eyes or its brain. And those things you can't do with a digital image. So in essence, we think that physical vouchers may generate bigger incentives to generate new information that might ultimately help with the data maintenance aspect, inspiring people to contribute to data maintenance more than just a digital voucher. And of course, vouchers are important for biology because they're useful for all sorts of different types of research. And the physical vouchers are stored in research collections for long-term reuse. That's important. But let's not forget the physicality of digital vouchers. A lot of people think that just because it's digital, it's not really, it doesn't have any physicality, but it really does. It sits on a server, and that server needs to be maintained. That server costs money. It needs to be updated. It runs on energy. So there's a physicality to both of these. That is also important to note. And obviously, it's also stored. So one of the portals portals that where we were doing interviews, there was a big lack of trust in the portal because at one point the server just basically shut down and nobody could get to their data. And that's because funding ran out, and until somebody else took it over, nobody had access to any of their data. So you can see that there is a certain physicality to both. Now, looking at the case studies and the research questions. So the case studies are basically the four portals that we've included in the analysis. So we have GenBank, which is a sequence database that is open access. Well, first of all four of them are open access. So GenBank is a sequence database that contains annotated collections of all publicly available nucleotide sequences and their protein translations, so all of this. It is hosted by the US government. It has designated funding from the US government, and it is tied in with 3 other international sequencing databases, and they share information on a daily basis. So then we have GBIF, which I just mentioned with regard to iNaturalist, which is this global biodiversity data aggregator. Symbiota SERNEC is the Southeast Regional Network of Expertise and Collections. It is one of over 50 biodiversity portals that is hosted on the Symbiota content biodiversity data management software, which is run out of ASU. And then we have iNaturalist, which is a citizen science platform. So looking at it in a little bit more detail, and we have GenBank, GBIF, SERNEC, and iNaturalist next to each other. So GenBank is the oldest ones, run by the US government. GBIF is an international organization, so it has designated funding from its member organizations, which can be governments, universities. It basically has to be organizations that deal with biodiversity data. And then SERNEC and iNaturalist are basically grant-based. SERNEC actually recently lost its funding, but it is still being active. And iNaturalist receives grants and donations. And here are the different types of data that are included: DNA sequences, occurrence records, that includes, so GBIF includes data from iNaturalist and also from eBird, for example. They call these occurrence records. SERNEC only has herbarium specimens from the southeastern US, and obviously images and metadata, so the vouchers are behind it. And then here it's observations.
Can I just interrupt?
Yeah,
with
go
a
ahead.
question? So
Yeah.
are these all nonprofits incorporated in the United States?
I don't know.
iNaturalist is global,
iNaturalist is global.
but
GBIF is global. Regional, GenBank is probably more national, although I put down regional. And SERNEC is also, well, I put down regional because it's all over the US, and SERNEC is in the US, Eastern US.
yeah, the one, I was just curious if they're all incorporated in the United States. That's my nonprofit kind of questions coming at you.
Yeah, I
can discuss later.
I can tell you that GBIF is international. It's an international organization, and their headquarters is in Copenhagen. iNaturalist is US based initially, but it is a global platform. But all of these are accessible globally. That's the open access part. I don't know about the exact incorporation, except GenBank is run by the US government. So, yeah. Sorry. So anyways, this is the context of the 4 databases. We included them because they're similar. They all have biodiversity data, although this is just sequences. And they have different ranges and different sources of funding, which is also interesting to look at, especially from a provisioning perspective. And we'll get into that momentarily. So the research question, the overarching research question, which is inspired by the IAD, obviously, although I don't necessarily use it in the paper, is how do these open data portals, biophysical and social characteristics, interact with portal rules to generate these data provisioning structures? So again, looking at the biophysical attributes and institutions to see how does data provisioning occur. And with provisioning, again, I mean contributing data, but also maintaining the data, data verification and oversight, and also any formal, what I also looked for were any formal incentives that incentivize people to either contribute or maintain data. And so basically, we're looking at these data portals as knowledge commons. And because I work with people who are not common scholars, Beckett came up with this visualization of what it is that we are actually trying to explore here. And he created what I call this a Venn diagram that is basically situated in this concept of everyone in the world who may be interested in this particular portal's data, and then narrowing it down to the pool of potentially relevant participants, so people who could potentially provide provisioning services to the portal, which is generally outlined in the constitutive aims and goals, and then looking at the authority, who has the capacity to provision, and who may be incentivized. And again, this is all based on the formal rules. We haven't looked at perceptions per se. And then this boundary payoff rules, there's different configurations of rules. This is just an initial conceptualization that Beckett did, so I couldn't modify it because he's out of town. But basically know that this isn't just payoff rules. It's not just boundary rules, although they are present in these 2 Venn diagram bubbles. And it's also not just vouchering rules who affect the capacity. But this was just a different way to kind of conceptualize as to what we're looking at. And ideally, it's this sweet spot that people are both authorized, have the capacity, and are incentivized. And as a result of that, they are able to provision data, both contribute and maintain the data. And that is particularly important in portals that are dependent on grant funding and have these boom or bust cycles, like SERNEC, which currently is in a bust cycle, where you really are depending, and Brenda knows this from the nonprofit sector, you're dependent on people to basically contribute without being paid. So out of the goodness of their heart, or because they feel strongly in this particular governance structure. So unless there are any questions about the context, did I miss anything? Was that pretty clear? Am I good on time? Any questions? I see something in chat, but I can't. Okay. Yes. Thank you for that, Brenda. Okay, so looking at the IG 2.0, which of course is my favorite thing to talk about. So brace yourself. These are the documents that I drew on. So I basically rifled through so this is completely different to any formal rules that you've ever analyzed, which are handily available. You know what you want to look at. With these portals, you've got to do digging and rooting around like a little pig on each website to see where do they have their information and how much of it actually pertains to data provisioning. So I kind of broke this down into the objectives, into the action situations that I'm interested in exploring, which are the objectives, which outline, what are our aims and objectives and who are we targeting. Voucher requirements, because we think they're important to incentivizing people's contributions and maintenance of the portals. And then I lumped together the provisioning, maintenance, and oversight mechanisms, just because it was easier. And I looked at any formal incentives. And so you can see that there weren't a lot of documents here. Documents but pretty similar in range, and also the institutional statements were pretty similar across, although sometimes there were some that didn't have as many. Where was that example? Like here, 14 SERNEC didn't have a lot on voucher requirements in comparison to the others. And these are the total institutional statements. I looked at both regulative and constitutive, and I coded over 880 institutional statements were included in the analysis. Hello. Okay. So one of the things that I really did want to talk to you about, in particular, because this is the IGRI community, is the way deontics and models are structured, modals are structured, and what that actually means in the context of an institutional statement, but also in the context of the governance system itself. So we know a lot about deontics. Legal scholars have given us plenty of guidance on that. And so I feel very comfortable saying that shall and must are legally binding when they occur in an institutional statement. May is permissive. It's legally binding, but you don't have to do it. So if you don't do it, there's not going to be a consequence, a legal consequence as a result of it. Should is generally a recommendation. You can do it or not do it. Nobody cares, basically. And will is this gray zone, which is a normative expectation. So it's not really mandatory, but it's also not really a recommendation. It lives in this in-between space, which I'm sure legal scholars just love to talk about. It's kind of a little bit of a headache from an institutional analysis perspective. So then looking at the modal, which, you know, we kind of sort of had before the IG 2.0, but Chris and Saba have really done a lot of work, as we all know, and are grateful for on the IG 2.0 for us to be able to actually look at constitutive rules from and analyzing them using the IG 2.0. So in my dissertation research, I knew constitutive rules were important, but there was no IG 2.0, so I had to use Searle's X counts as Y and C, and the modals were not clearly defined. So it really is an area that I think merits some more exploration and identification so that we can get them to be as consistent as the deontic. Now, as you know, modals, in contrast, so deontics, as we all know, prescribe or permit or prohibit behavior by actors. The modals, in contrast, set up the rules of the game. They parameterize the system, they outline system conditions. And there's a Taurus 2021 paper that has a modal table that I generally adopted, except for his conceptualization of shall and should, which is opposite. So he says shall is optional and should is necessary. I tend to disagree because it has to follow what the legal scholars say. It's just my assessment. So shall and must, to me, if it's a mandatory, legally binding, and a regulative rule, it has to be a necessary, compulsory condition or parameter in a systems context. Same here with a may is a possibility, as a possible condition, should is optional, and will or would is projected. So that's one of the things that I wanted to discuss with you about. The really important little bit of nugget, a really critical aspect of the difference between deontics and modals that Saba and Christopher mentioned in the IG 2.0 book is that when a deontic is missing in a statement, it means that this is not a mandatory action, right? It just basically means you can do this or you can't do it. However, the modal is missing, it means it's necessary, because if it weren't necessary, why even write about it? If it's not necessary, it has to be necessary to the conditions, otherwise why even include it? And so I think that is an important distinction that we can use as we're analyzing governance or rule configurations in general. And I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions or comments on that. I have some examples.
Yeah, Ute,
Yeah.
could you explain what you mean by legally binding? Because that seems to be getting into or else's, you know?
Ah, That is basically a legal scholar ease for if you don't do it, there is going to be an or else. So definitely a shall means it is mandatory. And if it's not done and you get caught, I guess is the other, or there is the political will to enforce, so that there will be sanctions. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it's just a different way of, yeah, okay. It's just
Yeah,
a way of thinking about these things than the grammar thinks about them.
oh yeah, well, I've been working with legal scholars, so maybe I'm tainted in that way. And at the international level, they have very strict meanings that I did not necessarily want to diverge from,
Sure.
because it otherwise applying any other. Yeah, I thought it was important to look at the legal context because that's going to drive the or else, right? If it is
So,
legally,
yeah,
yeah, if it's legally binding and they're all not doing it, then the or else is not being enforced. So that's an enforcement problem, right?
yeah, yeah. So it's like should and wills aren't legally binding. So what, in grammar world, that would be like a norm or a strategy. And then permissive or mandatory are rules, but yeah, if nobody does a may, who cares? Because it's a may anyway, right?
Yeah, it's a
permissive.
may, but it has a little bit of a stronger implementation than a should. A should is take it or leave it. And honestly, most of the international treaties, there's a lot of shoulds in there.
What do you mean by take it or leave it?
Take it or leave it was a recommendation. So, I mean, they're recommending, for example, they're recommending that you monitor your fisheries, for example.
Okay,
But so you should be monitoring your fisheries. It's a recommendation. Nobody is going to set up a mechanism to monitor
Okay.
this, for example.
okay,
May, on the other hand, would be like, you may, they're definitely going to be looking and seeing who is complying with this and who's not, and what are the outcomes of that.
but in that case, with the fact that it's permissive, not
Yeah, they're still not going to be doing
complying,
anything.
you're
Yeah.
actually violating something, right?
Yeah,
But you could do nothing and not be in violation.
correct. So there
Okay.
may or may not be an or else here. There probably won't be an or else here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
No, thank you. I mean, it made me think about this a little bit more carefully. So I have some examples where there's a no modal, and it's this is the one, and I put the inline coding here. It's a constitutive rule outlining basically that the most important source of new data for GenBank is direct submissions from scientists. So there is no modal here, but it's clear if GenBank doesn't get direct submissions from scientists, they might as well just close shop because that's all they get. There is no entity that's sending them information. It's really all just scientist submission based. So this is a necessary system parameter. If it doesn't exist, GenBank likely doesn't exist. And then we have a no deontic, a permissive action that basically says that NCBI, that's a government entity affiliated with GenBank, and I can't remember what the abbreviation stands for, but it provides timely and accurate processing and biological review and is ready to assist. Again, there's no deontic, and it's really a permissive action. I mean, what is a scientist going to do if NCBI doesn't provide timely and accurate processing, right? I mean, they're just going to have to wait. They need the processing in order to get their data in. They need to get their data in order to publish. So, I mean, this is permissive. There's not going to be an or else. People are just going to have to wait. So this is kind of the difference between what what the implication is of a lack of a modal versus a lack of a deontic. So critical here, permissive here. Yes.
May I interrupt again?
Oh, yes. This is what's
So these are really interesting examples, and just looking at them, you know, without looking at your coding or anything, I would have looked at them and said, these aren't institutional statements.
Ah,
They're just descriptors. I mean, they're just, you know, this is what GenBank does, or
yeah, I
that
probably,
NCBI does. And so I don't see them as institutional statements.
well, I don't know what to say to that, except that when you're,
Ute, can I
Yes.
ask a question?
yes,
So, I see, particularly with the first one, Adela's point, but is it based on your kind of conversations with people that they are basically, like the first one, the most important source of new data for GenBank is direct submissions, that is like what they prioritize when they're making decisions or something like this, so it is actually, they're actionable, even though they don't look like statements necessarily, or at least the first one?
yeah. Well, it has the components, right? It has the IG in the atomic components are present, and it is an important context to GenBank. Like I just said, if there aren't any direct submissions, GenBank doesn't exist. Now, the one thing that I probably should have pointed out earlier is that when you're coding formal documents, they're created by legal, lawyers, policymakers. There's a certain structure to them. The documents that I code are created by scientists for scientists mainly. So the way that they write things is not always identical to the way you would expect it in a policy document. And so it requires, as always with IG coding, some context. And I mean, I didn't change the statement. To me, it's an institutional statement. It's a constitutive statement that outlines the context of how GenBank operates. So I don't know how else to say that.
Ute, this is
Yes.
Dan. Would this be similar to getting preambles to official documents?
Yeah, this comes from this is in the aims and objectives of GenBank. Well, they don't call, again, you can't find a section that says aims and objectives, but it says what is GenBank, and then it gives you the spiel of where it situates itself on the global scale and what it aims to do and what it relies on.
Yeah, and I don't have experience coding the preambles as much, but it's been done before, correct? Preambles being coded as institutional statements?
Oh, I coded them. Well, I've coded them, so I don't know if I can cite myself, but because I could be consistently wrong. But yes, I code them. To me, they're constitutive.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, my sense on that one is like, if it has a like operational, not operational levels, just like if it has an operational impact on how these people are making decisions within the system, then those would be statements. Otherwise, like if they're just sort of, like a statement of priorities or something like this, then I might put them in as like a preamble that's really just, offering some general description of the focus of these organizations.
Okay.
But it sounds like if it's scientists speaking to scientists, it might be having an operational impact. Like if you're in scientific decision making, like this is the most important, like that's the information that you prioritize or something like that. That seems like an institutional statement. I'm not sure.
I think I'm going to have to go back and look at the definition of an institutional statement.
Well, I think that what Sava raised earlier, or what you raised earlier too, is how important context is. And so, yeah, depending on the other statements that are surrounding this statement, I think, it would be helpful to make your case that this is in fact an institutional statement.
Okay.
Raises a really interesting question I hadn't given much thought to.
Well,
Interesting.
okay. Good. Well, and I appreciate the feedback because it also gives me something to nibble on. Because as you know, when you code, especially if you code as a single coder, I mean, you're immersed in your own world, and that's one of the reasons why I really appreciate the feedback. So thanks. And since we're discussing, we might as well discuss the definitions of the 7 rule types from a regulative and a constitutive perspective. And here at the bottom, I've included some of the ones, and you might find interesting the statement of fact one, which is a quasi-constitutive rule that provides important context on a governance system. And I also have an example on that, but that might be some of what I'm hearing you say. So these are ones that I included in my rule typology that I developed for constitutive rules when I was coding for my dissertation research pre-IG 2.0. And I tried applying the regulative to the constitutive, but because nothing was really specifically defined and all I had was silly Searle, but at least it was something, it was really hard to connect, except for position and information regulative rules, any of the other ones to what I was coding as constitutive in the treaties. And maybe that was part of because some of it wasn't really an institutional statement, I don't know. But anyways, inspired by both Adela and Tommy, who did a presentation on constitutive rules applying the regulative rule typology back in March, actually at U of A last year, I went ahead and I gave it another try with this set of coding, not my treaties, but these portals, to come up with definitions for a constitutive rule type definitions for the regulative rule types. And so I don't want to go into this too much, but I have some examples. And then I also included, because I thought they were important, even though definition might be a subset of boundary, value may be a subset of scope. Statement of fact, like I said, is a quasi-constitutive rule, but important in the treaty context. And I also found it sometimes useful. There were only, I think, 2 or 3 instances in the portals, but nevertheless, I did use it. So here's an example of boundary, regulative, and constitutive. Here's the regulative, the constitutive boundaries. Submitters to GenBank and SRA, that's another database, are generally responsible for requesting changes to the status of their sequence data. And the regulative form is that you also have the ability to hide other users' comments and suspend them for violations of iNaturalist community guidelines. So that's an action versus a system parameter on boundary. I have choice and scope. And so with choice and scope, there was an important distinction between choice and scope, whereas, because in the constitutive realm, they are a little bit, well, even regulative choice and scope sometimes are, they were the things that I found initially hardest to code. But the distinction on the constitutive side is that the choice basically, in contrast to scope rules, focus on controllable system parameters versus scope are more forward-looking, future-looking. And so I have 2 examples for choice, scope on the regulative, on the constitutive side, that's the red, and then here on the regulative side. And I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to leave this there and we can discuss later. Here's an example of a value constitutive rule. iNaturalist mission is to connect people to nature. And then a statement of fact. So here's a statement of fact constitutive rule, these quasi-constitutive rule. Occurrence data sets make up the core of data published through gbif.org, offering evidence of the occurrence of a species or other taxon. So again, it's similar. So, which begs to differ, shouldn't I have coded the GenBank one as an SOF, statement of fact? Because this is a similar statement to the one that we just talked about at GenBank. You know, it's just basically saying occurrence data sets make up the core of the data in GBIF.
But is it the one thing that seems different here?
Mhm.
Sorry, Ute.
No,
This is
no,
a presentation,
this
not
is
a
what I want.
conversation. So this one, I guess the one thing that would make me feel like this is a statement of fact is if it's kind of, though it has those similar qualities, is it like just saying what's actually true? Like of
Mhm.
all of the data, this is the like the largest share is this data, or
Yeah, it's
it is
basic,
something like
yeah,
this, then that seems very much of a statement of fact. The GenBank one,
is more system.
because it was said something about like this is like the most important or something like that. That's the aspect that made me think, okay, is it basically by claiming its priority over other forms of
Right,
information, like suggesting that it should be prioritized in any decision making or something like that?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, just a thought.
No, I think, and that's probably why I coded them differently, although the discussion now makes me question my own coding. So, which may or may not be a good thing. So,
No, that happens to me all the time, Ute.
oh, thank you.
Me
I thought
too.
it was just me.
Oh.
Yeah. So I'm just gonna leave this here, but I think, yeah, I think it's important for us to, and I'd like to contribute to definitions for the rule types, because I do think now, having coded these portals and being able to use the IG 2.0, which I couldn't with my treaties, and I haven't found time to go back and redo the constitutive rules in the IG 2.0. I do think that the regulative rules, and that was Ostrom's intent after all, they do map onto constitutive rule functions in a certain way, just like the aims do. It's not always just the aim or the function, it's also looking at the execution constraints as well. But I think there definitely can be an argument made that the regulative rule types can be carried over into constitutive system parameters based on how the statements are crafted and their intent. So results, Jesus, I talk too much. I'm just going to quickly go over some of the results, not with a deep dive. Looking at the portal aims and goals, I found that all the portals use constitutive choice information rules to outline portal access as controllable and necessary system features. Provision data ranges were narrowly defined in GenBank, and that's because it's a sequence data, and SERNEC, because it's herbarium specimens from a particular region, to more broader biodiversity data provisioning objectives in GBIF and iNaturalist. And the maximal pool, so if you think of that Venn diagram, again, outside the Venn diagram, the maximal pool of people targeted from which the portals may draw is broad in all portals except GenBank. And I'll show a Venn diagram that in a minute. So here are some examples that I don't want to go over with. Vouchering is permitted in all portals. And the portals generally use regulative choice, GenBank and GBIF, and regulative information rules to provide vouchering guidance to their contributors. iNaturalist is really interesting because it uses constitutive information and boundary rules to parameterize observation records and requirements. I already said that it's permitted. Permitted voucher type, and I think I'm going to get into this in the next slide. So I think the boundaries affect actor vouchering capacities to a limited group of expert actors in GenBank, GBIF, and SERNEC because of the actor constraints. And iNaturalist, in contrast, is very broad and has very sweeping authority for most anybody to contribute. I'm going to go over that, but here's this is vouchering frequency estimates, where we actually went into the portals to see how many of the occurrence or observation records have vouchers attached to them, physical vouchers, and what type of voucher. And so GenBank allows physical vouchers. You don't have to. There's a whole selection of things that you can attach to your records. Vouchers or physical specimens is just one of them. It's not used very much, so it's very low frequency. GBIF and SERNEC both allow physical and digital vouchers. That's because they're connected to collections, and collections have specimens in their archives. GBIF, it's moderate, and in SERNEC, it's very high, and that's because these are herbariums. So, I mean, most anything that you find on SERNEC is based on a herbarium specimen. So it's an image of what's in a drawer somewhere or filed somewhere. iNaturalist is just digital only, very high vouchering. Because if you want research grade, I mean, technically on iNaturalist, you can upload just a sound record, but it's never going to reach research grade. And most people do like to take pictures and engage with the community. That's the whole context or the community aspect of iNaturalist. So contributing data is narrowly limited. Contributor pool is narrowly limited again in GenBank and SERNEC. GBIF, the contributor pool is moderate, and iNaturalist broad, like I just discussed. And then the capacity, this is where it gets interesting. So GenBank, you have to be somebody who knows genomes. I can't upload anything. I don't know how to sequence, and I don't have access to a lab that will allow me to do it. SERNEC, the same thing. I mean, you can't just upload a picture of a plant. You have to be an expert on plants, and you have to be affiliated with a collection to even get to the, so that you can even be authorized to contribute. GBIF, you have to be an organization that's affiliated and vetted with GBIF and iNaturalist. Anyone with a phone and the iNat app, feel free. Maintaining data is a little bit of a different story. Again, we have narrow, moderate, narrow in GenBank. It's only genomists and people that are doing sequencing work. And then you have moderate in GBIF because it's based on organizations, and broad in SERNEC and iNaturalist. I'm going to skip through this really quick. With data oversight, so their oversight process in GenBank is very limited. So if it can only be a contributor. If you notice that there's something wrong with your record, you have to petition NCBI or send NCBI a note, and then they look at it and decide whether or not they're going to edit. If somebody else sees something wrong with your sequence data, they can't do anything about it. And that has actually spun a whole new data portal, Beckett told me, where people are commenting on what records in GenBank are actually reliable and which ones aren't. GBIF, the oversight happens in the organizations themselves, and if they correct mistakes, they're responsible for uploading updated data to GBIF. Nothing happens at GBIF's level. They just suck up data and make it available. They don't do any maintenance at all or oversight. SERNEC, has very broad internal and external review of data, where people who did not contribute data can comment and basically petition the collections managers to make edits. iNaturalist is basically the community based. So the community can reject an identification if they say, no, you're not right. This isn't a javelina, it's a duck, whatever. If you have enough people objecting, it's never going to reach research grade. So that's the way they do their oversight. Formal incentives, the really interesting thing that I want to highlight here is none of the portals have any incentives for data maintenance. If they have incentives, it's really just for contributions, which is that gap that I was talking about. It's good to have data, but you also have to know, you have to maintain your data. It's the same that we do with roads. Let's just build a new road, but, fixing it, that's a different story. Nobody wants to invest in maintenance, and it's the same here with data. So findings and discussions, basically thinking about that Venn diagram that I did, I just created some Venn diagrams that represent what's going on in these individual portals. So this is GenBank. So the authority rules are very narrow. There's a narrow pool of relevant people who can contribute. There's only physical vouchers, low vouchering. It's very specific data that's being provisioned. And the incentives are fairly well developed. And that's because, but it's only focused on contributions. So GenBank has a system where if you're doing sequencing, you cannot publish your paper unless your sequencing data has been uploaded to a GenBank. So that's a hard stop incentive for you to publish. If you want to publish, you got to submit to a GenBank. So that makes this a fairly well-developed moderate bubble. It would actually be bigger, but for the fact that it doesn't have any maintenance incentives, and the incentives for third parties to contribute is really narrow. Contrast that to GBIF, where you have a broad capacity, a bubble, with a lot of vouchering, a variety of biodiversity data, both physical and digital, but then that's kind of tempered by it's only organizations that can do it, and you have to have somewhat of expert, but there also is expert and non-expert knowledge, because remember, GBIF also sucks up iNat and eBird, which are the citizen science, but very narrow incentives. And again, none of these have editing incentives. And here, the moderate contributor actor groups, so the editing is a little bit, involves more entities than it does in GenBank, for example. And you have this broad maximum pool, although, again, you have to be affiliated with an organization. So there's your the first step that limits contributions. Here's SERNEC. It's a little bit similar. So you have broad, moderate capacity, moderate authority, and narrow incentives, but narrow incentives. And finally, iNaturalist, which is broad in all aspects. And I'm going to leave it there because we are totally out of time. So sorry about that. I hope this was informative and that we still have time for some questions.
Yeah, we can probably take one question. If someone has one.
I'm really curious about kind of the incentive structures for people to participate, because you've got scientists who are really, this is their careers. They want to do this. But for others, the volunteering, are they having, I guess the question is, are they having trouble getting people to participate? What are some of the key challenges that these organizations are facing, or are they all doing quite well? Just kind of curious about big picture here.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Really amazing, thorough work. I just really appreciate the depth that you've gone in to understand this kind of Venn diagram of what's going on. It's really amazing.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Brenda. I'm sorry for not diving into the incentives a little bit further. So one of the things that I said in my promising abstract was that the vouchers actually provide incentives, and to a certain degree they do, but SERNEC, like I mentioned, SERNEC was one of over 50 portals that are on the Symbiota platform. Of those 50 portals, SERNEC is probably one that's doing okay. They don't have funding anymore, but they have this dedicated core of people that just feel strongly invested in the portal itself. But that's not a factor of the actual incentive structure of the portal. It's more a love of creating this portal and nurturing it. It's kind of their baby. So you have this core group of people, which I'm sure you're very familiar with in the nonprofit sector. So vouchering may or may not provide additional incentives. The fact that, well, I know that there's a lot of outside people that go to SERNEC as an authority versus iNaturalist as less of an authority, because the vouchers are seemingly vetted, but it often overlooks the fact that the maintenance isn't that great. So not everything, SERNEC is an expert portal, but not everything on it is really accurate, because there is no money to invest in maintenance. So I think the key thing that happens when you don't have dedicated funding is the data slowly goes stale. People may still be contributing, but they might not be contributing as much. They're still invested in their work, but the portal has a limited usefulness because there aren't any incentives that link it, for example, to publications like GenBank.
Yeah, the same problem happens in open source software. When they get to be a top level project, then it's been made, right? The software's out there, but they still need to maintain it. Like there might be bugs and fixes and patches, but it typically goes down to very few people, and it's a burden because it's volunteer work and nobody's funding it.
I think the main thing is that we really need to pay attention to maintenance and think about creating incentives for people to maintain. I think that's one of the gaps that this really highlighted to me, much more so than the vouchering. The vouchering is kind of like a side dish that may or may not be important. It is important to recognize that both digital and physical vouchers have a physicality to them and need to be maintained, because that's also another thing that university admins often do. You know, now you've digitized your herbarium, well, let's just get rid of it, the whole herbarium. And that overlooks the fact that there's so much new knowledge that hasn't even been tapped into in these collections. To just throw them in the bin is just outrageous. And a lot of big universities are doing that now. Oh, we've digitized, let's just get rid of it all. So, yeah. So I'm going to stop talking and see if there's any other, and thank you for your feedback and for listening for me rambling on here for so long.
Juan, go ahead.
First, Professor, thank you very much for this talk. And I'm sorry because I missed the first 15 minutes.
Oh, don't worry.
But I wanted to ask if maybe trying to get the full picture, if you check the terms of service or terms and conditions, and if there might be some institutional statement there for the, I mean, what whoever is uploading the data has, thinking that there might be something of institutions informed there. And also, I wanted to ask you, what do you consider about the institutions in use? Maybe these communities have developed their own ways of approaching and sharing how to maintain the data. What do you think about those two things? And thank you. I think it's really great to start using the IG to look other things rather than like the policies we usually look.
Thank you, Ron, and I'm glad that you joined us. So this is a foundational paper, which is one of the reasons it took so long, because I was just trying to wade through all this stuff and try to make sense of it all. But yeah, it's foundational in looking at the formal rule structure, and we've already done interviews as part of the NSF-funded project with portals on Symbiota. And so this is going to inform the next step where we're looking at the Symbiota rule structure versus how it's perceived and how that might lead to provisioning or lack of provisioning. And we have over 50 portals, and we've done interviews of people in, I think, 10 or 11 of those portals to see how they perceive the portals and how why some portals do better than others, even though they might have similar funding, lack of funding or funding constraints. So that's definitely, this is supposed to be foundational, kind of laying the land, so to speak, I hope.
Thank you very much.
All right. I think we will wrap it up there on that note. Thank you,
Thank you very
Ute,
much
for presenting, and thank you to everybody for attending and for your questions and your comments. And we'll see you next month.
Thanks, Ute. That was really awesome.
Thank
Yes.
you. Thank you,
you.
Saba. Thank you.